So if you remember, there were two kingdoms. It was the northern kingdom of Israel, southern kingdom of Judah. So the northern kingdom had already been conquered by the Assyrians. The 10 tribes had been lost, had been scattered all over. The last time we spoke about Jerusalem standing up to the forces of the Assyrians, this miraculous victory of King Chizkiyahu over Sancherib, who trapped Jerusalem and Chizkiyahu like a bird in a cage, but he was not able to vanquish Jerusalem. And actually, Rabbi Berger, a couple days ago in our pre-Shavuot study session, he brought some military historian who said that was the single most important battle in the history of the world. Because if that battle is lost, then you don't have Judaism, you don't have Christianity, you don't have Islam. And there's a strong argument to be made there. And so the future of the Jewish people, of the Jewish nation, is won at that very battle. So last time we dealt with the circle in green, Isaiah and Chizkiyahu. This time we're going to deal with the purple circle, which is Yirmiyahu and Josiah. So just a little reminder, last time when we spoke about Jeremiah, one of the things that Jeremiah was bitterly sore about was the fact that Jews had started to take slaves back. And he was very, very angry about that. He sees that as part of the fall and the decline of Israel. I'm going to try and show you when I think that took place, but I can't be 100% sure. But it is very important for us to talk about King Josiah, Yoshiyahu. Now, probably most people have never heard that name, Josiah. I would say he is in your top 5 kings of Israel. So if I had to do top 5 kings, I'm going to go, or kings of Judah, I'm going to go David, Solomon, Chizkiyahu. Yoshiyahu has got to be my 4th. I don't know who's going to be the 5th, but Yoshiyahu's my 4th most important king. Now, he's super important, first of all, because he starts this campaign to clean up the Beit HaMikdash. The temple at that time had been riddled with idol worship of all sorts. And this is going to shock you a little bit, but one of the things that took place in the temple, that is literally the words of the prophet say, the houses of male prostitution. So we're not 100% sure what that means. This is my best guess. There is some evidence of male prostitutions in Hittite culture. There is also evidence of male prostitution in, sorry, I went too quickly in my animation. There is evidence of male prostitution.
Animation.
Yeah, it is. Well, that's the Yoshiyahu destroying them. Hold on, we haven't gotten to that point yet. It does actually say in the text that he destroys these houses of male prostitution. There are various references in the Torah to the fact that there were these sort of cults of male prostitution where young boys would become initiated, and then they later on would become these priests of these rings of male prostitution. There's not a ton which is known about it. There's just a hint here or there in various parts of the Bible, cryptic reference in the book of Job, some references in the books of Kings and Chronicles. But there is no question that there are 2 Hebrew words for prostitute. One is the word zonah, the other one is the word kedesha. The male version of that is kedeshim. And it says that Yoshiyahu took out the houses of the kedeshim he burnt them up, and here comes the animation. He burnt them up and destroyed them from the Temple Mount. So this sort of gives you a sense of why it is that the Bible is so angry at this concept of idol worship, because idol worship contains in it some of these very, very cruel and angry or abusive practices, like forced prostitution of young boys in these cultic practices. That's really sort of a distraction, I guess, a point of interest, because it tells us a little bit about the color of what those days were like. But almost as fascinating is, you see in this etching of King Josiah, you see that there you have a looks like a scribe, that he's reading a book of the law. Well, this is just because in the Renaissance they weren't terribly focused on this idea of a scroll, but Yoshiyahu, in his cleaning of the Beit HaMikdash, finds a Torah scroll. Yoshiyahu discovers a Sefer Torah and he takes it very seriously. And he takes the curses in there, the warnings in there very seriously, and he wants to make sure he starts this whole campaign to get everybody to repent, to get rid of their idol worship, get rid of their prostitution things. He really tries to reform the people. But there is an old saying in business, which is that culture eats strategy for breakfast. Well, that's what happened. Yoshiyahu was trying to change a culture, but it is very difficult to change a culture. He may be the king, he may have the keys to the strategy, but he wasn't really successful in totally changing the culture, which means that the decays, the social decays, the moral decays in Jerusalem were just headed downhill. And then we come to something, a very important word. You should know the origins of this word. Does anyone you guys know what this word is? Armageddon? So Armageddon is there's a couple definitions I pasted here from Google, right? The last battle between good and evil is one from the New Testament. And it is the sort of thought as the end of the world. I'm sure nobody here below the age of 40 knows this, but those of you remember, this is, a young Bruce Willis, and this is the movie Armageddon. The movie Armageddon was about this asteroid that's going to destroy the Earth, and they have to blow it up with a nuclear bomb, and Bruce Willis is the only guy who can do it, and of course, like with 30 seconds to spare, he manages to get the nuclear bomb through the asteroid, and yay, the world is saved. But that's all about Armageddon. Armageddon in popular English means the end of the world. But Armageddon really comes from a Hebrew word, which is this one. It's called Har Megiddo. Now, this seems like a reasonably nice place. What should be so horrible about this place that we think it's the place where the end of the world is going to happen? And the answer is that there is a battle that takes place there between Pharaoh Necho and the king Josiah. Pharaoh Necho is headed up north to fight the Assyrians. And whether or not Josiah, he's there to fight the Babylonians. Josiah, whether he's formally aligned with the Babylonians or doesn't want anything to do with the Egyptians, or exactly why he enters the battle is very unclear. But it doesn't really matter. That is where King Josiah goes to meet Pharaoh Necho on the field of battle. And Josiah, this great king, this great reformer, this king who found the Sefer Torah after it had been buried for a long time, who removed all of these abuses, tried to get the people in line, he dies on the field of battle. The Egyptian archers strike him in battle and he dies. And this happens in the year 609. And so I put this big stop sign here because I want you to understand this is one of the most important events in Jewish history. Year 609 is the last time that there is a Jewish king ruling with Jewish sovereignty in Israel until the Maccabees. The death of Yoshiyahu is the end of Jews governing their own land. After that, we are only dealing with puppet kings. So those kings are, and if you thought the other names were confusing, these guys confuse me unbelievably. Yehoachaz, Yehoyakim, Yehoyachim, and Tzidkiyahu. Tzidkiyahu is at least, doesn't sound like any of the other guys. The last three kings, Yehoachaz, Yehoyakim, Yehoachim, these are three different sons of Josiah. The first one, Yehoachaz, he's barely long enough to keep the seat warm, and he gets taken captive to Egypt. I put in yellow Yehoyakim and Yehoyachim, and you're like, wait, aren't those the same name? They're almost the same name, right? They are, they are off by literally one letter. And
they're excluding COVID.
The what we have with Jehoiakim is that he is fully an Egyptian puppet. And if you ask me to put my finger at that time when the Jews start to take slaves, I think it's right there, because what happens is he is fully invested in Egypt, and we know that Egyptian culture is very, very slave-ridden. And so it seems to me that if I had to put my finger where Jeremiah is afraid that we're having a reversion to slavery in Jewish culture, that's where I assume it is. Jehoiakim he's actually, this is exceedingly important, he is captured, and this is when most of the Jews end up being exiled to Babylonia. Famous Jews like Daniel in the lion's den, the family of Mordechai in the Purim story, they're all taken away to Babylon. He takes the nobility of Israel off to Babylon. And the Babylonian Jewish community, anybody want to venture a guess how long the Babylonian Jewish community lasted from the days of Jehoiakim in, we'll call it 575 BCE? When's the last time Jews were found in Babylon, which is modern day Iraq? I looked this up just before.
I'm just guessing until just after the Holocaust.
So I would have probably a better year to sort of where it all fell off the map was in 1948, 1967. Once the Jewish state happens in Israel, so then it becomes very, very inhospitable for Jews in Iraq. The David family, right? Eitan David and Yael David. I don't know which other David I saw there, but your family comes from Iraq, right?
Yeah, my father's side.
Your father's side comes from Iraq, and what year did your father emigrate from Baghdad to Israel?
Right, overland by foot in 56.
Okay, so that
Okay.
right, that's right in between.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's
right in between 48 and 67, and things got really bad in 67. But what I looked at, and there was this famous Operation Ezra Nehemiah, which brought the Iraqi Jews into Israel.
Right, exactly, through Iran.
How times have changed.
Right.
But the interesting thing is, in 2003, I think they did an exploration of Jews remaining in Iraq, and they found 34 Jews remaining in Iraq. But you have to appreciate that. I mean, I don't know how far Tony David's family goes back in Iraq, whether they were in Spain and then made it to Iraq, or there was one of those families that was Jewish in Iraq for literally thousands of years. But that is arguably one of the oldest Jewish communities anywhere, right? The Iraqi Jewish community, because the Babylonian Jewish community was in continuous existence since this year, we'll call it 575. That is, in and of itself, is incredible.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what does puppets mean? A puppet king?
Okay, so a puppet king means that really they pay this enormous tribute to Egypt. They have to fight wars with Egypt. They do everything according to what Egypt wants them to do. But their local nobility that is being, essentially, they get their instructions from the Egyptians. If you will, it's a little bit like the relationship between the United States and Puerto Rico, or it's like the relationship between China and Tibet, right? There is some sense that they're slightly different, but really they operate under the sovereignty of a different different authority, right? So the authority is the Egyptians, and they are essentially aligning themselves with their Egyptian. They're also depending on Egyptian protection from the Babylonians. It's a very big theme in the book of Jeremiah. That's why Jeremiah gets thrown in jail, because Jeremiah tells them, don't trust the Egyptians. The Babylonians are going to override them, and they don't want to hear it. So they throw Jeremiah in jail. So
So, Rabbi, it's fair to say that Josiah was the last of the Davidic lineage as king.
These are all his sons, so they're part of the Davidic lineage. But he's the last one to be independent, right? He ruled Judea without influence from other kings. It was Jews under Jewish rule. Once you get to these three kings, they rule at the pleasure of Egypt. And Tzidkiyahu rules at the pleasure of Babylon. Then he rebels against Babylon, and then it's over. Right? So I colored them a little bit differently. Yehoachaz, because maybe he was still Jewishly allegiant, so I made him blue. Yehoiakim and Yehoiachim are both really Egyptian puppets, and ultimately they're conquered by the Babylonians. And Tzidkiyahu may have pretend to be Babylonian, but really wants to try and break away. So he also is, I put him in purple. But none of them act independently. Judea is now, it's not a petty state anymore. Petty meaning small state. It belongs to some other empire. And here's the great villain of the story. The destruction of the temple happens at the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. 586 BCE. We have the temple is destroyed in Jerusalem. Now we don't think about this now, but you have to appreciate. I come to this event, the destruction of the temple in 586, from the perspective of a Jew who is, let's say, the great-grandson of somebody who lived in Chizkiyahu's day. So you get these family stories about how the most powerful king in the world was attempting to conquer your city. And this is the city where God rests. Not just the God of Israel, but this is God, the creator, Melech Malchei Amlachim, the King of Kings. There is the all-powerful God, right? And so when Sancherib came to try and destroy Jerusalem, he was not able to do so. Why? Because Sancherib is nothing compared to God. And so Jerusalem, of course, defeated Sancherib. But now you have Nebuchadnezzar, who has conquered Jerusalem. So how are we supposed to interpret the fact that Nebuchadnezzar conquered Jerusalem? Now, we live now with this ingrained in us for 2,500 years. For 2,500 years, we have had this message instilled in us. And it is, I think, very much a part of our culture, and it's part of what makes us strong and resilient and gives Jews great agency. But you know what that is? I think it very much belongs to the world of the prophets. Well, anyway, okay, but maybe before I tell you what the prophets say, let's see how well it really is ingrained in you. What's the explanation? How is it that the all-powerful God's house got destroyed by this, this flesh and blood king, Nebuchadnezzar?
Because the Jews had sinned, and this was God allowing it to occur because of the sin the Jews had done at the time.
Okay, see, it was very well instilled, right? What do we call this?
A punishment.
Yeah, but when it's a characteristic of ours as Jews, what do we call that? Jewish guilt. Jewish guilt. No? I think.
Yes.
I think we carry that well. But the idea is that Jewish guilt, the inverse of Jewish guilt is a very strong sense of agency, right? It's a very strong sense of, hey, we can really affect changes here. But so there's a historian who wrote a great history of Israel, sort of an academic work. His name is John Bright, and he makes the argument that the people who really prepared the Jews for this were the prophets. And this is Rembrandt's picture of Jeremiah mourning the destroyed Jerusalem. Over in the corner over here, you see the temple burning. and there's a wonderful pensive picture of Jeremiah lamenting. But so the question is that we sort of already covered is, how could God's house be destroyed? Creator, all powerful, how does Nebuchadnezzar triumph? I just took one chapter from the prophets. There are many, many, many between Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Jeremiah, and maybe some of the other smaller prophets that you could have chosen. I just happen to think this one is particularly poetic. It's Isaiah chapter 28. And in Isaiah chapter 28, he talks about how he's heard, he says, I've heard this decree of destruction from my Lord God of hosts against the land. And then he has this analogy. And he says, does he who plows to sow plow all the time, breaking up and furrowing his land? When he has smoothed the surface, does he not rather sprinkle the black cumin and scatter cumin? So apparently cumin and black cumin, they don't get put into the rows. Like when you plow wheat or barley, you insert them into the rows. But the other plants like cumin do better if they're sprinkled on top of the soil. And so first he says there's different ways of dealing with the soil. And his idea is that what he's going to do is going to compare the Jewish people, what's happening to them, their exile or their impending exile. He compares it to the ways in which different seeds are dealt with. Some seeds get planted in their proper home. That's when you're in your temple in your city. Sometimes they get scattered because they need a different environment to grow. And so the idea is that God does this to allow others to grow. And then he carries on the analogy. He talks about different kinds of grains are threshed differently. So the way you thresh a grain is that if the grains are in the kernel and you need to pop them out of the kernel in order to eat the grains. So cumin, you apparently comes out really easily. You can see on the left, there's this guy who's banging it with a stick. And that's what Isaiah actually says, that, bang it with a stick. Threshing for wheat is done on a threshing floor. That's your picture on the right. And you see there's a woman sitting on the threshing sled. That would have like spikes underneath. And she has her children playing on the back of the sled. And the oxen would go around and around. And the two guys in the middle, they throw more wheat there. And you need something really harsh to pop the kernels out. The point is that sometimes it's just a light smack. Sometimes it's a very harsh crushing. And sometimes in order to make wheat to grow, to do whatever is needed, it sometimes takes a harsher stance. And this is sort of, again, the idea that punishment is going to help the Jewish people. The destruction, I should just mention, going back just a few slides, it is an absolutely horrific event. There are babies whose heads are smashed. The starvation is almost unthinkable. There are direct reports in the prophetic literature in the Book of Lamentation about people needing to eat their children who have passed away in order to find food. It is the bitterest and worst situation you can possibly imagine. It is very hard to describe how not only was this a psychological tragedy in the fact that they thought Jerusalem would never be destroyed, but it was also an objective tragedy in terms of all of the horrible things that happened at that moment. And Jews almost ever since, maybe with a little bit of an interruption during the period of the Second Temple period, but more or less for 2,500 years, on the 9th day of Av, every year there is a very intense day of mourning to remember the destruction of this temple. This is something which is, and in your Birkat Hamazon, every time you eat bread, you're going to say, rebuild Jerusalem. This is where the idea of rebuilding Jerusalem becomes a central feature of who we are. But the good news is, after being sent off to Babylonia, after the trials and travails of this whole thing, the Persians vanquish over the Babylonians. And it is this gentleman here, Cyrus the Great, the great Persian king. He comes to the throne and he has a whole different operating philosophy than anybody else before him. He basically says, look, I don't want to control I don't care about your religion. I just want your taxes. So as long as you're paying your taxes, you guys get to have whatever religion makes you happy. And I'm going to be very supportive of your religion. And he decrees that the Jews can return to build their temple in Jerusalem. Now, here's another one of those moments where I say, stop. This is exceedingly important. I can't even stress how important it is, because there's no other ancient people that should be ever exiled to a foreign land to return to rebuild their temple and capital. There is only one ancient people that were ever exiled and returned. And it means that the prophets did an amazing job. The prophets gave the Jewish people a theology, a story, a framework, a method of thinking that allowed them to endure a 70-year period, maybe 2.5 generations, where they were in a foreign land, subjected to a foreign culture, very heavily attempting to integrate them into Babylonian society. And it is true that many Jews did not return when this decree happened. But this is the only time in ancient history. You can look throughout all of ancient history, all of ancient Mesopotamia, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, all of them, and you won't find another people that survived an exile and decided to come back. And this is one of those real miracles of Jewish history. This is one of those things that when in those moments of self-doubt of what is this all about? Is Judaism as important? This is one of the things you have to remember. You have to remember that all of this almost came to an end. When the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem, this could have been completely it. It could have been over. The Jewish story, roll the credits, that's it. The Jews have been lost. They're like the dodo bird, they're like the duck-billed platypus, like the woolly mammoth, the saber-toothed tiger. They could have all been relegated to the museum at that point. It is the only time that has happened. Now, if you remember our very first session, seems like it was in the BC era before COVID, but a long time ago, when we had our first session, basically what I showed you was there are at least 3 different times when the Jewish nation has been exiled and returned. And every time, they're really the only people to do that. The first time was when Jacob leaves the land of Israel, goes to Egypt, then they return. Second time is this time, after the destruction of the temple under the Babylonians, the Jews return. The third time happens more or less in living memory, happens in 1948. Actually, it happens well before 1948, because if you don't have streams and streams of Jews in the 1920s and the 1930s who stream into Israel, you don't have 1948. But you can, if you want to put a pin in a date, you can use 1948 because that's when we became a state. But that ended 2,000 years after the next destruction. We're still a few classes away from the next destruction, but this is one of those things you just have to emblazon on your mind. The Jews were able to return to their homeland. Now, this return was not all, trumpets and fanfare. So this is I've tried to scan this in as best as I could. I have a neat little book here that I picked up it's called Jerusalem in the Time of Nehemiah. And it has some great renderings of what they think Jerusalem looked like. So I'm going to just use my annotation tool. Hopefully I can use it properly. I've had some trouble with it lately, but we're going to give it a shot. Okay. Over here on this side, all of this in this drawing, all of this is called the Western Hill. And in this drawing, you'll notice, what do you see? I wonder if you can see it on your screen. Can you see the difference between the houses? Let's say I'm going to change it to the houses. I'm going to highlight in green and that which is in red. What's the difference between these houses? If you can't see it, it's just because the image isn't transferred well.
In red, they look like they're huts with grass roofs.
Okay.
And in green, they look like proper structures.
Okay, good. In truth, in the red, they're just rubble. They're destroyed houses. It's meant to refer to a whole area of the western hill of Jerusalem, which is just destroyed property. But it shows you that at the time of destruction, Jerusalem was 2 or 3 times as populous as it was at this hour, right? When Nehemiah comes back, or when the first waves of return from Babylon return to Jerusalem, they're a very small fraction of what they were before. And this entire section of the city is just left destroyed. I'm just going to jump forward a few. One of the reasons we know that about this area is the wall over here. Let's pick a different color. We'll make the wall pink. This wall over here in pink, this is what they call the broad wall. And the broad wall can actually be seen in Jerusalem today. This is the broad wall. I could give you 3 or 4 other pictures, but there are places where they have found this early Second Temple wall, which was the broad wall, which was an extension of the walls of Jerusalem, which never got rebuilt. It was just too much to do. And it just shows us that there was a whole area of Jerusalem that was never really restored during the times of Nehemiah. The takeaway lesson here is that this had a very feeble start. And that's really an understatement. It's an understatement to say that the rebirth of Zion was a trickle, not a waterfall. And it is threatened because there are lots of people at this point who think they have the right to control Jerusalem. There is always politics going on, and Nehemiah had real enemies. The Samaritans who lived just to the north in the Shomron, they thought that they should be the ones to control Jerusalem. There were competing lines of priests who thought they should control Jerusalem. And Nehemiah's job is to protect Jerusalem. They're trying to rebuild the temple, and it's feeble. There's all the prophets at that time tell us that it is a very feeble enterprise to try and rebuild Jerusalem. This is just another picture of the broad wall. The place which is called the Mishneh, it means the doubling of Jerusalem, and they think that was an extension. When the northern kingdom was destroyed, they think there were lots of refugees who came down to Jerusalem, and that extended wall was meant to accommodate them. But that had all been destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. That was all gone. That was all now not ancient history, but at least history. And so Nehemiah has to build the walls of Jerusalem. And what Nehemiah does to build the walls of Jerusalem is he's got to build all these different towers and ramparts. And there's some great names for these. You know, the Sheep Gate, and one is called the Tower of Maya. In the middle there, the Tower of Hananel, that's built by somebody named Hananel. And then all of these different sections here, section 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, are all built by different people. I can list off for you. If you read through the book of Nehemiah tells you all the people who built them. The names, they may mean something to you. I can tell you they don't mean very much to me, because they're just names of people who were there. So, you know, it was, section 1 was given to Mermot, the son of Uriah, the son of Koz. And then you have Meshulam, the son of Berachia. You get sort of the picture that he gave these different people who were around. He said, you build this section of the wall. What's impressive here is that the wall goes up in 50 days. Now, most of the scholars believe that the 50 days where those walls go up is really impossible. You can't build a real fortified wall with the technology they have. I don't know if Andrew's listening here, but I bet he would affirm that even with today's technology, you don't get your permits in 50 days. So I don't know whether you could build a wall in 50 days. Like that is really stretches the imagination. But what it could have been was that the wall was framed out and then filled in. Could be, you know, just it was enough to keep people out. But Nehemiah had a problem because people were attacking them even as they were building the wall. So he had to divide his forces in two, and he had to have half of them guard the wall and the other half of them build the wall. And he kept rotating them in different shifts. But Nehemiah's single job was to make sure that Jerusalem was protected and that they could actually build a physical structure. And Nehemiah himself was the cupbearer to Artaxerxes, is a sort of another Persian king. And if you read the book of Nehemiah, it talks about how he takes a particular opportunity to, the king sees that he's sullen, and he talks about the fact that the temple in Jerusalem, that Cyrus gave permission, but he can't really rebuild it. And so Artaxerxes gives him and funds him to do this. And even with the support of the crown, it becomes it becomes a very political affair. People try to falsely accuse him. People try to lure him to assassinate him. Really, the story of Nehemiah could be a great screenplay, because everybody wants to kill Nehemiah. Everybody wants to get rid of Nehemiah, but Nehemiah has one goal, and that goal is to build the walls of Jerusalem. Just a little bit of background. You can see this map right here shows you the red areas are areas where we have actual archaeological evidence, where they've actually seen parts of the walls that Nehemiah had built. And so they can actually see the stones, they can date them to that area and the various towers of what goes on, so that we can see that there is a real physical evidence of Nehemiah's work. The last thing, though, the thing I sort of have to leave us with is the following, is that Nehemiah succeeds in building the walls of Jerusalem. He succeeds in building the fortified city, but he has a problem. And Nehemiah's problem is that now that he's built the walls, he needs enough people to make the city thrive, to guard the walls, and to make it worth having built them. And he doesn't have that. And he has a people who are spiritually defunct, ignorant, intermarrying. They have no sense of who they are, and he is brilliant at restructuring the building process. He is brilliant at rebuilding Jerusalem. But what he's not brilliant at is creating a culture in Jerusalem that is going to allow it to sustain. He sort of just crosses the finish line on the building, but he doesn't yet have the right spirit of the place. And for that, we're going to need a new character, a new person in our story, and his name is Ezra. And he may be more important to your Judaism than anybody who has lived since Moses. Maybe Moses is the number one most influential Jew. I told you Isaiah was the most influential philosopher, but without Ezra, you wouldn't even know about either of them. So, but I have to leave it off here. I did not have time to squeeze Ezra into this particular lecture. So I'm going to stop the share and open it up for any questions that people have.
Thank you, Rabbi. That was great.
Okay, but no questions then.
None for me.
Eitan usually have a question.
So the walls we see now when we go to Jerusalem, what are they from? The walls.
I think there actually is one section of the wall which may be Nehemiah's wall. I read this over Yom Tov, so I wasn't able to take notes to highlight that. So I have to go back and look up. But I think there's one section of the wall which may be Nehemiah's wall. Most of the walls you see are medieval walls. There are some walls which are Herodian walls that you see. And then there are some places where in the city of David you might find things that go back further to maybe, Chizkiyahu. So yeah, and that broad wall that I showed you, that they think that might go all the way down to time, Chizkiyahu, Josiah. Yoshiyahu.
And the wall of the temple that we pray at, the western wall, where does that fit in with the walls?
Okay, so that wall is going to be about, I would say it's about 200 years away from where we're talking now. So yeah, it'll take us another 200 years to get to Herod and for him to build those walls.
So that's Second Temple. Then.
Yes, right. Well, you are now officially in the Second Temple period, right? Because Nehemiah is the Second Temple prophet.
And there was nothing that remained from the first temple at all?
Well, the actual temple is a really good question. If we were allowed to go to Israel, maybe we'll be able to do that next summer. Maybe we should start planning now. But there is a sifting project which takes stuff that got taken out of the Temple Mount and they sift it for different things. When we were there in December, we were able to participate in that. And you get little pieces of this or that. You know, you get a little piece of glass, you get a little piece of pottery, but there are some interesting things that have been found in that. But that stuff is all under, like the Temple Mount, the actual temple is under the mosques. So that's very hard to get at. But the things from the first temple period that we are seeing, like the seal of Isaiah, the seal of King Chizkiyahu, the seal of the jailer of Jeremiah, all of those things are coming out of Ir David, which is the city of David. And perhaps just for the chuckle value here, they even found a latrine there, and they were able to analyze what they had for dinner. So that we know, but the actual temple structure, I don't think has been discovered. So that's it. Yeah. Every day we're finding out more and more. There really is a lot that is being discovered, especially as they get lower and lower.
If only when Omar arrived in Jerusalem, someone would have told him that the holiest site in Jerusalem is where Jesus was crucified, where they intended to build the mosque. But now, unfortunately, we can't quite get at that material. It's a challenge.
Yeah. Well, had we not been so corrupt, maybe we wouldn't have to have all this interesting history, then rediscover it. But so be it. So be it. Anyway, I have to jump onto another obligation that I signed on to. So thank you all. Thanks for accommodating the earlier time. And
Thank you.
I hope to see you guys in 2 weeks. All right.